Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Emilie Nelson, welcome back to the Power Trends podcast. It's great to have you with us again. You've been with us on the podcast several times, and most recently on the last episode to discuss Power Trends, our annual State of the Markets and Grid report, which we published in June. For those folks who might be tuning into the first of these with you as our guest, you are our Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer at the New York Independent System Operator. You have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Tufts, an MBA from Pace University, and most recently you graduated from Harvard Business School's Advanced Management program. So welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Kevin. Pleasure to be here.
You'll be interested to hear that a professor from Pace University emailed us yesterday to pay compliments to the Power Trends podcast, and specifically the episode you were on with us, and said that he has assigned that episode as required listening for his students. He also paid compliments to an episode we recorded almost exactly 2 years ago with our former Senior Vice President of Market Structures, Rana Mukherjee. So I thought I'd share that with you.
That's excellent to hear. It seems like a lifetime ago, I think it was, that I was at Pace University. I think at the time, as many of us are doing in our 20s, it was working during the day and going to school at night. Good opportunity, fond memories. Happy to say I'm no longer going to school at night.
Yep. So we're flattered. I heard the same thing from an NYU professor, that there is required a Power Trends podcast on his syllabus. So again, we're flattered and grateful. You're with us today to talk about the heat wave of June 22nd and 25th. The combination of temperature and humidity were comparable to what we saw in a heat wave in 2013 when we experienced our all-time still standing peak load on the electric system in New York, just shy of 34,000 megawatts. You're going to talk us through this event and why else it was significant, but we also exceeded our predicted summer baseline forecast. We also had to employ several measures to restore reserve levels, make sure reliability was maintained. In these kind of events, Emilie, you're in the control room. If you can explain first what happens, we see the weather forecast, we know the heat wave is coming. What do we do and what are the operators doing to get ready before the temperature actually begins to rise?
Great question. Let's begin there. And let's also just take a moment to acknowledge that in order to successfully navigate through system conditions such as we experienced at the end of June and are continuing to manage through July, there is an incredible team, both here at the ISO and outside of the organization, our partners in reliability. And I'm talking about the operators, the technologists that are making sure that the systems are working, communication staff to make sure our message is getting out there, everything that goes into our markets, which really support our reliability mission. All of that has to come together and is on full display when we're experiencing these tight system conditions. So I know you share in Kevin in wanting to acknowledge the incredible folks that we have working on these things day in and day out. But going back to your question on what is done in advance, it's really most simply about communication and coordination. One of our primary responsibilities as a balancing authority is making sure we understand not only what's going on in New York and forecasting and projecting conditions and taking steps in advance of the hot weather, but also coordinating with our neighbors. And if you think about the Eastern interconnection extending from Canada down through the southern part of the United States, we need to have an understanding on if it is expected that areas like Quebec or Ontario are going to have excess supply, or if they're experiencing similar conditions, and right on down the eastern seaboard, because we really need to identify how we can support each other If there's an area which maybe has a little bit of surplus that can then be used to alleviate tighter conditions in a neighboring area. So we're doing a lot to provide that situational awareness. Other steps that are usually taken in advance of tight conditions: canceling any optional work on the transmission system, really extending the message to generators on the supply side, so that they are prepared. And then going into the day, our day ahead plan coming out of our day ahead market solution is giving us a good view of the commitment that we have, the generators and the other supply, the forecasted solar, wind, et cetera, that we are taking a really careful eye and reviewing to see if we can meet those real-time conditions and planning for those contingencies so that as we move into the day, we're as prepared as we can be.
So a lot of communication across the different regional transmission organizations and independent system operators, a lot of coordination within the state to make sure everybody's on the same page, prepared for the heat event. So then let's start with the 22nd. We know that it's going to be hot, and we're looking at reserve levels. What did we start to observe at the beginning of the heat wave?
One of the things that we're reviewing is what the forecasted conditions are, not just for a given day, but if there's a series of days. A heat wave is technically at least 3 days that's going to exceed 90 degrees. And what happens from a power system perspective is that when you have that prolonged heat and humidity, that is going to build, demand is going to build. We can easily communicate that. If there's just one day where it's hot, you may not need to have your air conditioner up as high. But if you're experiencing that day in and day out, and the nighttime temps are staying pretty high, then that gets uncomfortable in your homes. It gets uncomfortable in our buildings. And our summer peak demand is really driven by air conditioning load. And so if you have a multi-day event, then you need to be prepared that the demand is going to grow throughout that event, and the conditions are going to drive higher loads as that progresses. So going into that week in June, we're looking at a series of days where loads are projected to be high. We know that that is going to put additional strain on equipment, and therefore there could be outages on both the transmission side, the distribution side, as well as on the supply side. That is going to drive us deeper into our reserve capability. We're going to need to make sure we have a strong commitment of supply resources and be prepared for some of these events, some of these outages that are likely to transpire over the series of days.
So it really began on a Sunday when demand and load can be typically lower. But then as we got into Monday, what were some of the things that we began to observe on the system that maybe began to cause us some concern?
So certainly we're looking at those forecasted loads and they're not anticipated to abate. So we have a variety of programs and options that we need to decide to call on. So some of the things that we're doing and looking at on that Monday for the duration of the week is, do we need to put our demand response programs on notice because the conditions are expected to continue? We need to make that decision a day in advance and communicate that. And then we have a second opportunity, an option in real time to call on demand response if the conditions are being realized. We need to decide if we're going to put some of our external suppliers on notice that we need that power going into the next day.
This is where you mentioned earlier, perhaps Canada, perhaps neighboring
Absolutely.
regions like Pennsylvania, New Jersey.
Absolutely. And so if we're going to have that dependency, we need to make sure that the partner ISO or RTO is able to supply that. What are they experiencing? So you're having that communication. So we're providing some notice on that. We're looking at our commitment coming out of the day ahead market and evaluating if there's any supplemental commitments that are needed. Some of our supply resources have longer startup times, and that means that we really need to make that decision in advance in order to be prepared for those real-time conditions. So a lot of it is just advanced planning and coordination to make sure that you're preparing for those uncertainties that may manifest.
And we've been talking about declining reliability margins, and then the grid alert system that I mentioned earlier is hinged to when we issue an energy watch, declining reserve levels at that point. Walk us through what that means for those that may not understand reliability margins and reserve levels, what that means and why we would issue an energy watch in this case.
Sure, happy to do so. And I'm also pleased that I was on the Power Trends podcast earlier with Rich and you, Kevin, because we were communicating exactly what we experienced at the end of June. And that's also been augmented by many of our planning studies where we've been projecting that there are narrowing reliability margins, which means that there are fewer options to supply the demand and load that we need to meet under normal conditions, and emergency steps may need to be taken, such as dipping into the reserves that are available to be prepared for some of those contingency events. So we talked about that earlier this year, and here I am today talking with you about conditions that tracked almost precisely with those projections and that communication that we thought was important to get out. Going back to where you wanted to next move, which was thinking about the system conditions page that we established. When we are experiencing normal conditions, we're in a green state. We have ample supply to meet the load. And no particular concerns around meeting the demand on the system. When we go into a reduced level of capability to meet demand, we go into an energy watch. And we've tied that to having projected reserves that are less than 20 megawatts for more than 60 minutes. So it means that if we were to experience a contingency, a loss of a transmission line, a loss of a generator, then we may dip below that reserve amount because we're tighter from a conditions perspective, and we have less reserves available to respond to that contingency. And we continue to escalate in our communication from there. A warning is when we are less than 1,965 megawatts, which is tied to 1.5 times our largest contingency on the system, and that's projected to last for at least 30 minutes. So again, you're just having even less supply available to meet the projected demand. And part of what it will cover today is that as we progress through the week and moved into June 24th, we really exercised this communication system because we indeed were taking some of those emergency actions to manage the system.
You know, something you mentioned earlier, we've been communicating these declining reliability margins. It's really talking about that level of additional megawatts in the system for unforeseen circumstances. In this case, what we experienced in June was exactly that, where power plants that we may not call on very often, but were needed to produce energy to meet that rising demand. You mentioned earlier transmission line, but we also had some assets that we were counting on providing energy trip offline and fail to be able to produce. that is also part of the message that we've published in Power Trends and other places about the age of generation and the concerns we have with some of these assets being 50, in some cases 70 years old.
Sure. There were really a combination of factors, all of which we have been projecting and communicating that came together on June 24th. So let me run through some of those things. Really, what made that day significant from an operations perspective was the scale of hot weather, which extended from Canada, the Midwest, New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and of course, somewhat in the middle of all of that is New York. And the narrowing margins that we have been projecting in New York, the neighboring regions were also experiencing similarly tight conditions. I believe PJM and ISO New England experienced their highest peaks in over a decade. And so there's less interchange that is available, as we covered at the beginning of this podcast, to provide support to areas where it's tight, because that's happening, that's manifest across the Eastern Interconnect. We also had high loads. So just looking at New York loads, the actual peak we experienced occurred at around 6 p.m., 31,857 megawatts. For that same hour, we were in a demand response activation. So roughly speaking, that's about 1,000 megawatts.
And when you say demand response, in simple terms, we're talking about a tool that the control room operators are using to try and lessen the demand on the system. Can you just explain what practically that looks like?
Sure. So I mentioned previously that we need to make the decision day in advance that we think we might need demand response going into real time. And then we can activate that. These are capacity suppliers, so they are paid to be there and reduce their load when we make that call so that the peak load we need to manage is less. And we backcast after the fact to evaluate exactly how much response we received. But roughly speaking, it's about 1,000 megawatts of relief that is provided.
It could be a major manufacturer, for instance.
Correct. Correct. So these could be industrial sites that are reducing their production during these tight conditions. They're therefore reducing their load. It can be smaller scale resources in this particular program that on aggregate combine to have a meaningful impact. So it can be a variety of applications, but they are being paid to respond when system conditions are tight, and we provide the notice that relief is needed to manage the load. That's exactly right. So when you think about the peak load that we saw on that day, 31,857, about 1,000 megawatts of demand response. And we also have quite a bit of solar on the system. And so for that particular hour beginning 18, estimate that we had about 1,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar that was alleviating the peak load. When you put all these components together and you look at the combined temperature and heat index, you see that the gross load that was experienced in late June was very comparable to our all-time peak back in 2013. And when you expand that beyond the New York footprint and think about similar conditions across the Eastern Interconnection, you can appreciate why things were particularly tight on June 24th.
So we have now being called in our weather reports a major heat dome over a large geographical area. You've highlighted that a lot of the operational concerns that we have here in New York, again with declining reliability margins, is an experience that the other states and the other regions also are facing. So that limits, perhaps, and we saw this, the ability to share resources across different grids and different regional transmission organizations. We have some uh, units tripping offline that we under other circumstances would expect to be there. And we have the heat, not just over a large geographical area, but persistent over a number of days. And so that also, the heat is absorbed by concrete, houses, buildings, and that builds. So we're talking about a lot of air conditioning load that continues to go up over a number of days. That becomes a struggle to meet that demand. And these tools that you're describing become exceedingly important in order to make sure the lights stay on. What happened? You mentioned the behind the meter solar. So this is the small solar resources, not the major utility solar, but small installations. When the sun begins to set and that solar backs off, what did we see as we entered into the nighttime hours that became a concern?
So solar is a tremendous resource to help meet our energy needs. What we're seeing is that the highest contribution from both behind the meter and front of the meter solar occurs earlier in the day. It occurs at around noon. And then as you progress through the day, the amount of production from solar facilities decreases. And as the sun begins to set and the solar production decreases, we have to continue to meet the demand on the system, the load on the system with other resources. And so you end up having a prolonged period of what we see as that load that needs to be satisfied, that really extends deeper into the evening.
During the daylight hours, when there's enough sun, that behind the meter solar is a great contribution. It helps to shave that peak demand.
That's right.
Then of course, as the sun sets, that starts to come off. And what we see is the load continuing to increase into the nighttime hours. And that's where the control room operators are looking in their toolbox for solutions to try and meet that increasing demand even into the nighttime hours.
That's right. So when we're evaluating what resources we will have available to us in real time, the more diverse resources we have available, the better we will be positioned to manage through a variety of reliability conditions.
And we did have some sizable contribution at one point from wind, which is, I don't want to say unusual, but in the summer during daylight hours, it's not what we would expect. Is that fair?
That is fair. Wind is variable, right? And so there are days where it is available. And during this particular heat wave at the end of June, we had a decent contribution on certain days. That's really beneficial. It helps meet that energy need.
But like you said, it's variable. So when it did begin to abate, we had to go look for other resources to meet the increased demand.
That's exactly right. Another thing that I should highlight, some of the steps that we needed to take when we were really moving into the evening on the 24th. We had to purchase emergency energy from some of the neighboring regions. And we did so from some of our Canadian and American neighbors in order to support reliability on this day. That is something that has been used to all of our benefits through the years to manage periods of cold and heat, and certainly is an additional tool for the operators.
But as you were describing earlier, part of the challenge in this case was that other regions were looking for cooperation and additional megawatts from different regions. So everyone was sort of in the same challenging situation.
There was a need that was uniform across all of the regions that needed to be satisfied. And so how it works in these most stressed conditions is we are trying to manage keeping each area as stable as possible, and really looking to see if, for example, New England is experiencing even less of the supply that they need to meet their demand, then we're going to respect that and try not to push them further into that condition. And the operators are balancing that across all of these regions, because ultimately what we want is we want the Eastern interconnection to stay stable. So it is carefully managed, carefully coordinated, and there's when there's a period of just significant need across the system, there's less options for the operators to manage.
But all those control rooms are working together to, as you said, make sure from a regional perspective things are balanced. It's a mutual assistance strategy.
Exactly. That's right. That's right.
So as we look at the rest of the summer, it looks like there could be additional hot weather. Any takeaways for you and coming out of the control room from the June event that you want our listeners to know about?
We are always looking on how can things be improved? What can we do different? What can be made better? So coming out of the June experience, we look at how can we coordinate better across the footprint with the regions? How are the market outcomes supporting that reliability objective? How did the forecast manifest with actual conditions? And is there an improvement associated with that? So that is continuous learning, continuous improvement. And we've integrated a lot of those observations from the end of June into our preparedness.
You talked about the forecast. Forecast is exceedingly important because it gives you a strategy and a plan and some intelligence as you go into the event. So you want to make sure that that is as close as possible to what the actual experienced elements are going to be like. That's become more challenging over the years. Maybe you can explain, some of the challenges with our forecasting now that we have more and new different resources on the system, and then these extreme weather events.
Absolutely. It is more challenging. It's challenging across sort of the spectrum. So if we consider the early 2000s, load forecasting was really important to understand how much is that demand from air conditioning, et cetera, going to manifest into the load that needs to be managed in day. And then we needed to also incorporate forecasting of wind because that is a variable resource. So somewhere around 2010, we started building out that forecast capability and integrating it into the control room tools and into our market so that we could make sure we had a commitment and a dispatch of the balance of the system reflecting what was projected from wind resources. And then move ahead. And now it's also critically important that we have solar forecasting. So that would include front of the meter as well as behind the meter solar resources, because as we've discussed throughout our conversation today, that really impacts the net load that needs to be managed, but also the ramp, the change across the renewable output throughout the day that we also need to manage. So we synthesize all of this information so that we have the best plans, the least cost set of resources to meet demand each and every day. And when you're talking about forecasting, I started this description with saying it was load in the early 2000s. Now it's load, it's wind, and it's solar. So you have essentially three variables that need to be managed. So there's more uncertainty around that. And the other element that we should include in this conversation is how has weather changed? How has shifts in the climate really impacted the variability we can see with respect to weather, thereby impacting all three of those elements to a greater extent. And that is an additional element that we are working to evolve our forecasting techniques so we have the best information available to guide our actions each and every day.
So, that historic weather data is really helpful, but it also can give us a little bit of a challenge in understanding what the next day or the next week is going to look like, because these weather patterns and the length and extremity of these events is changing. In addition, you're saying a lot of that small scale behind the meter solar increasingly important to understand how much is there moment to moment. And then also understanding what the weather's like, because that can go away suddenly when the clouds roll in. Because our control room operators are going to have to adjust. They're going to have to pick another fossil unit perhaps in order to back that up when it does disappear. It sounds like all of these different elements are relatively new challenges that show up in the control room and require sharper decision making.
That's right. And our forecasting team, that includes meteorologists, have a direct line of communication to our operators. And to give listeners a sense of the detail of the conversation, just this morning in advance of Friday's condition, one of the conversations that was happening was a review of the increased likelihood that there would be cloud cover on Friday upstate and how deep that would extend toward Newburgh, New York, to understand what that might mean from system conditions and the loads that might manifest on Friday afternoon. And so that's the conversation that was happening this morning, Wednesday morning, in advance of conditions for Friday afternoon. And that will be fine-tuned as we get into those real-time conditions, because if there's cloud cover, if there's some drops of rain, that can really impact the overall load that is needed and some of the steps that have to be taken. So that is the level of care and concern and focus on detail that goes on continuously to try to get this right.
Great detail, because of course it's going to impact the amount of solar that is showing up on
That's
the system. Right. But it'll also change consumers' behavior when they look at the thermostat, because all of a sudden it's not as hot, perhaps.
Exactly.
I think we have to also just cover quickly the issue of price. There's coming out of the June event, there's been a lot of discussion in the press about prices, not just here in New York, but as we've been saying, a theme in this discussion is across the regions, prices were up. So simple laws of supply and demand. It seems like there's, in a general sense, and we've been talking about this here too, less of we have retired a lot of fossil plants in the last few years, and so there's less generation overall in the system available, and demand continues to be high in certain cases, especially in June, and so prices were up. But maybe you can walk us through. We saw what we call some reference prices in different parts of the state, but those are the real-time prices, and that's not necessarily what people are paying. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit of the details on how prices are set, but then also affected by these events.
There are day ahead market prices, and then there are real time. And we see that the vast majority of market activity really occurs in the day ahead timeframe. It's roughly 95% of the market activity is happening day ahead. And why is that? That is because if there are unexpected events and the system becomes tighter, prices are going to escalate going into real time. And so if loads and quite frankly, supply are able to lock in a firm plan on a day ahead basis, there's going to be more certainty on the schedules that need to be realized. And prices are not going to be as high if those conditions become tighter into real time. So
when you
roughly
absolutely need it.
Yes, absolutely. So, looking back at the end of June, day ahead market prices ballpark were in the $200 to $500 per megawatt hour range. And then going into real time, they were substantially higher than that because we were experiencing tighter conditions, reserve shortages. And so, uh, those positions that were taken in day ahead really serve as a mechanism to provide some protection for consumers to not be exposed to those real-time conditions. It's also important to note that, for example, if you have a supply resource, let's say you have a large-scale generator that received a day ahead commitment and then tripped off and was unavailable in real time, they have to buy out of that position. And what that means is that they have to replace the energy that they were unable to provide in real time at that higher price point. So that's a really important performance incentive that those resources that are getting the day ahead commitment are able to perform going into real time.
Don't let them just walk away and say, sorry, I'm not able to make that commitment. They have a responsibility to make good on that. It's sort of a way to make sure that, as you put it before, it's a protection against some higher prices that consumers could, under other circumstances, end up paying. It also smooths out some volatility in the price.
That's exactly right. It's providing that incentive for these resources that we are counting on a day ahead basis to be there to meet the load, to meet that demand from consumers going into real time.
So when our consumers across the state need that air conditioning, when it's that hot and there is a health and safety issue with providing that air conditioning, it's there, and we're not paying thousands of dollars otherwise for that power.
That's right. That's right.
Emilie, any other takeaways or high points that you wanted to underscore here for our listeners? This has been terrific.
Again, I'll express my appreciation for all those who are part of this system, trying to make sure that we can meet reliability day in and day out. And I guess in close, I'll also acknowledge that it's really important that we continue to share these messages on what we're projecting for the future grid and what we are seeing in actual system operations, because we really need to work together to find solutions to make sure that we can continue to serve New York reliably and support health, safety, the economy in the way that every New Yorker should expect and deserve going forward.
Perfect place to end this particular podcast. Hello to all the students out there that are listening. And Emilie, thanks again for joining us on this particularly interesting run through of what happened in June.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate your time, Kevin.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.